So in the summer of 2009, when I was doing my dissertation research, part of that was family oral history research with my Mexican American family. I interviewed my mother, two of my biological aunts, an aunt who had married into the family, and her mother, who's not any relation to me, were interviews that I did in Kansas. And the point was to think about, how does Mexican American identity manifest in the Midwest, and is that similar or different than growing up in a community like in Texas or California or even New Mexico, where there are people who look like you, where there's communities and where it's not this sense of isolation. And in the course of that collection of research, my aunts and my mother told me a lot of stories about their grandmother, who had 13 children, who was very mean to them, and I never met this woman. She was, I would assume, very tired, and her grandchildren were the same ages as some of her children. So I imagine that her role as a grandmother was maybe a little different than what we would conceive of as this, very kind, loving woman who dotes on grandchildren kind of, archetype that we have. And so they told me all these stories about my grandmother, and then I did some more research into her and created a digital story about kind of the process of collecting those oral histories and writing Mexican American women into the Midwest, thinking about our presence here, even though it might not be in the history books, but that we are here. And in that digital story, I shared my own interpretation of my great-grandmother as someone who was probably overworked, right? I didn't see mean, but I saw tired in her eyes in this particular image. And my aunts and my mother saw this digital story, and at the end of that, came up to me and said, you made me think about my grandmother differently after your interpretation. So in that small moment, right, valuing different perspectives, valuing what people take away from a story, became an instrumental part of changing my own family's interpretation of this family member who I had never met. So that would be an individual example of how I think storytelling can be very powerful. I think I use digital storytelling in my classes. I teach digital storytelling. My really great friend Rachel Ramist, who's a feminist filmmaker and also a professor at the University of Alabama, taught me how to do digital storytelling, and I thought it was a really great tool to also teach students both the skills of how to interact in a digital age, right? Learning how to edit on software that they might not be familiar with, that they might be afraid of, typically as women, to encourage them to put their own story alongside some of the theory or research that we had been reading throughout the course of a semester. And I think those digital stories become an agent of change in themselves, right? So I collect them on our course blog, and so students can always have this site of reference where they can always point people to those links. And I hear stories that they share them far and wide. The beauty of social media is that they can post it on Facebook or their Twitter or even their Tumblr, and it will go far beyond what it did in our classroom. And I'm really invested in those kinds of practices. How do we cultivate a sense of community in a space, but then how do we also then send that to a larger level outside of that local community? And how can we track the experience of viewing that, or create a dialogue or continue a conversation about that story? And many of the stories my students create are about things that are very personal to them. Struggling with family members or themselves with eating disorders, for instance, has been a really big underlying theme that I think counters some of the notions around how social media has typically been used for, unfortunately, creating communities for people to build those skills to continue to do bad things around food. So challenging those notions, creating opportunities for people to discuss some of the things that we've talked about in our class outside of the classroom. And I think that that really should be the role of the academy, right? To create opportunities for people to learn within it, but then to take that knowledge outside of it and to try to dissolve that barrier between the academy and the community, because this isn't, I don't want to participate in an ivory tower. It is an ivory tower, but how do we erode some of those boundaries that prevent some people from engaging? And I see digital storytelling as one of those ways that we can cultivate communities outside of the very insular classroom that unfortunately is a pretty privileged space for the most part, right?
Yeah, and I'm curious if a young person somewhere would be interested in digital storytelling but doesn't have access to your class
Mm-hmm.
or a similar class,
Mm-hmm.
are there any places or resources you would suggest people go to learn about how to build that skill?
Yeah, so I know that the Center for Digital Storytelling is probably the premier place in the country where people are talking about like the pedagogical value of doing that work. They typically train people to do that work in communities. I'm connected with a lot of groups like the Center for Media Justice, for instance, or Magnet, which is a network of media justice organizer-based coalitions of people who are working to, on a lot of levels, advocacy level, doing political advocacy for keeping the internet free, for instance, to creating spaces to put technology in the hands of people who don't have access to them. So a myriad ways that they're addressing this idea of media justice that is pretty intentionally inclusive and really amazing, doing a really amazing job at doing that kind of work. So I would say that maybe going through some of those avenues, you might be able to find someone in your local community that's doing that kind of work. It's definitely outside of just the academy. There are people who are doing that work. I'm trying to think of the name of an organization in Philadelphia, Fan Mail, FAAN dash mail, MAIL. It's run by a collective of women of color. They use filmmaking techniques. They do kind of community-based organizing around putting those skills and tools in the hands of other women of color while also critiquing the representations of women in the media. They do a lot of things. But I think there are places like that in a lot of communities that are trying to teach young people how do we responsibly interact with media. Another group would be the Media Literacy Project, based in Albuquerque, New Mexico, actually, that I've known for quite some time, since I was in high school, actually. And they deconstruct media, they analyze media, and they produce their own stories. And so I think more and more we should see places and communities that are invested in providing those skills and resources for students and for young people. And you would be able to find some pretty easily, I think, in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and even around here, right? I gave a workshop on how to do storytelling in a digital age at the library as part of a series of workshops that my friend Chris and I organized. We're the co-founders of something called Third Side Media, which is not an organization but more a resource for community members to try to use some of these tools and skills that corporations have access and money to do to enliven the use of media for social justice. And so how do we tell our stories in such a way so as to inspire people to both get involved and take action? And what kinds of skills do we need to be preparing students as they're going into the workforce to be able to sell as something that's valuable in this very media saturated environment that we're in? So I think, deconstruction and production go hand in hand, and that is necessary in building those visions for living in a world that reflects our diverse communities.